All right. Good evening, everybody. Looks like we still have a couple on their way in, but I want to go ahead and get started. So if I am looking off to the side every once in a while, it's just because I'm letting people into the room as we get started here. Welcome to week number 4. I do want to just sort of apologize a bit for last year. I'm glad that I'm appreciative that everyone was able to be flexible at the last minute. My first few weeks of school year have been, let's say, complicated is a good word for it. My department chair is still out and has not been in since the beginning of the year. So I've been having to kind of serve double duty at school involving some things after school. So hopefully that will end next week and I can get back to being just one person instead of 2 at school, which would be nice. So anyways, for this evening, I want to just kind of get us back on track, see if there are any questions or concerns that anybody has from the first couple of weeks. The topics for tonight are really just an extension of last week's work. We are in that analysis piece of the instructional design, so we haven't even really settled on exactly what it is that we are trying to get our students to be able to do, but by the end of this week, we will have that nailed down and we'll be able to start getting into the actual instruction piece of the design work. So we're going to look tonight at 2 main topics. One is going to be an audience analysis or audience assessment. And we'll just have kind of a discussion about what kinds of things are part of an audience assessment and sort of how to go about that and what that information can be used for. And then the second topic for tonight has to do with actually setting our instructional goals, which is kind of the bottom line of all of the analysis pieces. We've analyzed the need, identified what the problem was, and found out what the need is. We have looked at the context that the instruction is going to take place in. So what's the environment? What are the standards that are being taught under? Those sorts of things. And then with the addition this week of looking at the audience assessment, where we're looking at the actual students that are going to be being taught, at that point, we should then be able to actually develop the goals for instruction, the things that we want the students to be able to do or know. And we're going to be looking at a particular format for goals called a SMART goal. Looking over the forum posts from last week, it looks like a lot of you have had some contact with the SMART goal format in one form or another. So it'll be more just kind of tying into that. For those of you who have not been introduced to the SMART goal format, we will be taking a look at that tonight and what each of those letters means and how that would apply to actually creating a goal. So with all of that information in hand, then you will be able to put the final touches on the phase 1 of the instructional design plan, which is really what this week is focused on. That's really the only homework for this week, is just continuing to work on that phase 1 from last week, try to get it put together and get it submitted. And then starting next week, we will start looking at the actual instruction piece, and we'll be starting the planning phase where we'll be breaking down the goal that we've come up with into smaller pieces, figuring out sequencing, figuring out segmenting of the instruction, and then eventually that will then lead us into the materials that we're going to need and so on. So that's our brief overview of things. But before I get any further than that, any questions about the work from last week or even the last couple of weeks, since we didn't get a chance to meet in person last week? Anything that I can help address at this point, or anything along those lines, things doing with the needs assessment, things related to context assessment. All right. Well, I will take that to mean that we don't have questions at the moment, but as always, feel free to throw out questions or concerns as they come up as we go. So, all right. So the last thing, actually, before we go forward, that I meant to say is I had intended over the past week to get a chance to look in on everybody's topic suggestions. I have not been able to get to everybody on that, but my goal is over the next couple of days to be able to do that. So I'm going to be looking at the posts that you made in the forum from a couple weeks ago and get some feedback on those. I've gotten to a few people, and some people have been asking me to look at specific things, so I've been trying to get back to those people. But I hope now that my schedule at school is starting to calm down a bit, that I will get some time to take a look at all of those. So you should be able to see some, if you go back to that forum over the next couple of days. I will try to get a post in everybody's post about your topic selection to give you some feedback on that. So, all right, so let's turn our attention to the first of the two topics for tonight. Let me share out my screen here, jump over to Safari, get myself organized here. Always takes a little bit to get things reshuffled on the screen. Come on, where's the corner? All right, there we go. Just want to make sure that I can see everybody and see if anybody's got hands raised or anything like that with questions. All right, so yeah, this is the overview page for this week. I basically just went over that information. So let me jump over then to our discussion notes, give ourselves a little more room here, get into where we can add some notes to the page. So yeah, so the first topic for tonight, and I thought we could just treat this kind of like an open discussion, is to talk about the audience analysis piece of the analysis phase, and specifically kind of why is it important to do an audience analysis? In other words, what kinds of things does doing an audience analysis allow you to do with your instructional design plan? What kinds of things are important to know in that audience analysis? So if you're going to be getting information about your audience, your students, what specifically are the kinds of things that you'd like to be learning? And then finally, sort of what are the ways that you can go about learning those things once we kind of understand um, what it is that we want to gather and so on. What are the ways that we can go about actually learning that stuff? So yeah, so this is going to be an open discussion. I would say just kind of chime in. We're a small enough group, I think, that people can just kind of chime in, unmute yourselves when you've got something to contribute or something that you want to comment on from something somebody else said. So let's see, let's just kind of get the ball rolling here in terms of why is it important to do an audience analysis? What are the things that doing an audience analysis might let you do with your instructional design that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't do the audience analysis? So is there anybody that wants to kick us off with first bullet point here? And I'll just kind of take notes as people talk. So why would it be important to learn about your audience, learn about your students?
I think for the why, it's super important to know the audience because you want to be able to make sure you're reaching them where they are. If they're not ready for a certain thing or it's way up for them, then it's not going to mean as much as if reaching them where they are.
All right, so part of it, like knowing what do they know already, making sure that they're ready for whatever instruction you're going to be providing. Yeah, I like the reaching students where they are, because that can kind of, I think, break out into a bunch of different fronts here. So maybe what would be some other things, along with, finding out what they know already? What would be some other things that kind of reaching the students where they are might let you know about them?
Well,
Anybody? Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
yeah, I think that it's like almost like public speaking. You want to know who your audience is. So this way you know what kind of language to use. You want to know what is the average age of the audience. And experience. So you want to make that distinction so you can tailor your presentation, your approach, so you can meet them where they are.
All right. Yeah, a couple of good things in there. I mean, language use, I mean, maybe that's almost too obvious to say, but we should say it, is language, I mean, literally in terms of what language you're using. Because, of course, many of us teach in situations where we have multilingual students or multilingual content, but also language use sort of connected to that second thing of the age appropriateness. I mean, obviously, if you're going to be designing instruction for second graders, your vocabulary that you're going to use, the way that you frame certain information is going to be very different than if you're designing that instruction for high school students or for college students or for adults. So that idea of language kind of has multiple elements to it. Um, yeah, and the tailoring approach, I think that's kind of a really key thing. Um, I mean, that's basically making sure that every student, um, that you're taking into account sort of what every student has in terms of their abilities or the way that they want to approach things. So I'm trying to find the word. It's not diversified instruction. It's somebody help me out here. What's the word? It's shoot, I'm blanking. Not diversified isn't the right word. It's
Differentiated?
differentiated. Thank you. I knew it was a D word and I just got stuck on diversified. So this idea of differentiation, I mean, that's probably you've run into that in other places. But the idea that we really need to treat our group of students in front of us as a group of individuals, as opposed to making any kind of blanket assumption that they are all going to react to the learning in the same way, that they're all going to frame the learning with the same framework. Obviously, we've got issues of, varying cultural backgrounds, things like that. So we want to make sure that that the way that we're designing the instruction is going to be relevant for the students. And that can be culturally, it can be having to do with the community um, that the instruction's happening in, anything along those lines. So getting that, if you don't know your students, there's no way you're going to be able to differentiate to meet each of those students where they are. Um, so yeah, so all good things here. Anything else that somebody wants to toss onto that list? I think we've got some good things here. Um,
Just keeping in mind if a student has an IEP, going along the lines of differentiation, but there are certain things like specific in the IEP or 504 plans
yep.
that sometimes I change the way I speak to my students based on that.
Yeah,
Um,
and the other piece of that, in terms of why it's important to know the student's IEP or 504, is we are legally responsible for conforming to those plans. We don't have an option of a teacher of saying okay, I know this student has a 504 plan or that they've got an IEP, but I'm just going to teach the way I'm going to teach. Like, you can get into serious trouble if there's a meeting and a student's not doing well in the class and they come to you and say, well, what are you doing to accommodate this student according to their plan? And if you say, well, I don't even know what their plan is, or I'm not sure what they're supposed to be getting, that can put you in a fair amount of hot water. So yeah, definitely knowing what those plans are. I generally, because of course, if you've been a teacher, I don't know if your district does it the same way, but the beginning of the year, I'm getting packet after packet after packet from special ed, from guidance counselors, from everybody about all of the evaluations that have been done on all these students. And I just make sure that I flag each one of those students like in my rosters everywhere, so that I'm always reminding myself that if I'm doing an assessment, I got to check in and see what kind of accommodations this student needs for the assessment, or does this student get extra time for homework, or do they need verbal. I have a student right now that really can't write anything. So everything has to be done in a way that they can type responses. So I may be giving a paper handout to most of the class, but I have to make sure that there's also a digital version available so that that student can type their responses and do the work on their computer. So yeah, so I mean, that again goes back to the differentiation, but this is definitely a level of information that you kind of need to know, you're required to know about your students. So yeah, definitely. Anything else we want to throw into here?
Yes. You mentioned something about the cultural part of your audience. I think being aware of the majority of students, what is their culture? Okay. Of course, you can't appeal to each student's culture because they will be too detailed. But you kind of get an idea of the majority. What is the, the major culture of your audience? This way, you can reach the most of the students. Okay, by knowing what culture is the prominent culture of your audience, instead of just trying to appeal to every little culture, because you might lose one, you might lose a lot. But if you appeal to the major culture of your audience, then you know you're getting the brunt of your audience. And then later you can appeal to the rest of the other cultures, but at least you have the the big picture of the cultural aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways, and there's a whole concept called universal design, which I've been getting kind of interested in and starting to try to experiment with in my classes, which is to see if there are ways where you can accommodate sort of every student with sort of one plan, instead of the approach of coming up with a plan and then having to differentiate out for certain students, to see if there's ways to design lessons from the beginning that automatically will reach everybody. So yeah, I mean, you certainly if you're working in a community where there is a dominant culture, you want to make sure that you're taking that into account. I would say it's useful as much as you can to try to reach every student, even if there are small groups, because oftentimes it's those groups that feel sort of the least accommodated. So the more you can do, even if it's just a matter of, say, you're phrasing a bunch of word problems and just making sure that within the scope of that word problem, of those word problems, that there are examples that kind of cover the range of cultures or backgrounds or or whatever that you're dealing with. And obviously, too, that might change from year to year, and that's one thing about instructional design is that it's never static. You always are having to go back and make adjustments. Um, Yeah, I would also put down one that I had here, um, is mode of delivery, which just kind of covers like what kind of learners do you have? There's been a lot of research and talk about multiple intelligences and auditory learners and visual learners and kinesthetic learners. There, interestingly enough, that theory, while it exists, actually has been found to not be terribly effective if you treat it as like, okay, well, this person's a visual learner, so I'm going to give them everything visually, and this person's an auditory learner, so I'm going to give them everything through audio. That actually doesn't really deliver the results that you might think it does. But you still want to make sure that content is being delivered in the best way to match the kinds of learners that you might have, or that they're given a range of ways of accessing the content. And certainly because the technology delivery of instruction has become so big, that also encompasses making sure that the students are comfortable using the technology if they're going to have to be learning things online, or using certain applications or programs or things like that. So knowing your audience from that context of kind of what kinds of activities do they seem to respond to the best, so that then you can tailor the activities of the lesson to match those modes of delivery. Yeah, so we've got, I think, a pretty good range of things here, and I'm sure there's more things we could add to the list. Um, but this is why we need to do this. It's not something we can just gloss over. If we're going to have any hope of our instructional design actually having an impact and reaching the students, we need to understand who those students are and where they're coming from, what their skills are, what their preferences are, and so on, so that we can reach that tailored, differentiated approach that will make the learning effective for everybody. So I know there's a little bit of overlap here. So, like, for example, I know I can put this one right on this next list, because the why of it was because we're legally responsible for it, but we actually also just, that's something we need to know, is which students have IEPs or 504 plans and what those are. Um, so this is now more of like the actual, what is the data that we need to know. So in order for us to get to those things that are important, because we know they're important, what kinds of data would you want to gather from the students or about the students, beyond their IEPs and 504s? Like, what other information would be good to have?
Maybe some interests so that you can try to, you know, gear lessons towards, what people are interested in the room.
Okay. Um, Yeah, and again, that could be like, even just like I said, with like word problems. If you've got students in the class who are particularly interested in cars, if you're coming up with word problems, why not structure a couple of those along those lines? So yeah, if you can do some kind of a survey, or even just in talking with your students, kind of get a sense of, what are they interested in outside of the classroom, what are their particular areas that they like to explore. Because if you want to engage the students, a great way to do that is to engage them with your content through some kind of content that you already know that they like to engage with. So yeah, if there's a way to gather that kind of information. What else might be on there?
I know this is kind of an abstract concept. Maybe we've already talked about it a bit, but I know in particular teaching photography to inner city kids, for example, um, it's important to get them excited, but it's important that they're seeing visuals that reflect their environment, because their environment can be really interesting. But if you're showing flowers and white fences and all that kind of stuff, and you're teaching inner city kids, and you're not showing them how beautiful um, their streets are and how beautiful it is at night and all that kind of stuff. You're gonna, I think, I don't know. I think it's really important to make sure that your materials are reflecting the demographic that you're talking to, and that you show genuine excitement about the world that they're living in, and not just necessarily your own world. And especially if your work reflects your own world and not theirs. We
Yeah.
probably have talked about that already.
Yeah, no. But yeah, exactly. I mean, that would kind of go back to where we were talking about the cultural relevance and so on. So
Right, which
yeah,
that's
again,
basic,
like,
right, right.
yeah. So maybe through some kind of a survey, if you don't know the community, I know some teachers live in the communities where they teach and others don't. I live in the town where I teach, so I've got a pretty good idea of sort of culturally where my students are coming from. But if I was living out where I am right now, but teaching in, say, Hartford or New Britain, I would want to do something so that I could get a better idea of what the cultural and social and community backgrounds are of the students, so that I would be able to connect to them, because it's probably not the same as where I'm living and what my day-to-day experience is. So it would be important for me to find that out. So it could be talking to the students, formally or informally. It could be just going the extra mile to go into the community and see, if there's events that happen or things like that, and try to get yourself out into the community where the students live and get a sense of kind of how that community works and what kind of social interactions go on and cultural backgrounds there are. So yeah, that definitely, in terms of, I mean, you can't be culturally relevant if you don't know the the cultures of the students that you're trying to address. So yeah. And I think you use this word, so I'm going to throw it in here as well, but it also is sort of some of the more nitty gritty, but just basic demographics. I mean, you want to know the age of the students. You want to know, um, what the backgrounds are, what the sort of the I don't know, whatever comes with all of that kind of information that you might get through the school, or other things like that. How do the students identify? How do they see themselves? Sorts of things. So, all of that, age, all of those types of topics. So, just that basic information: how many students are there, so on and so forth. So, you had just sort of mentioned that, I think, demographics in terms of the larger community, but also just knowing the demographics of the students themselves. Um, what else might we want to gather in our list here of?
Yes. Um, I think we might want to gather well, from the job that I do in facilitating, and I go into a group or a class, I make a quick assessment of the motivation level. To do it. You know, are they about to go to sleep? Are they not focused, inattentive? Um, so I want to know, are they motivated or not motivated? And if they are motivated, what's motivating them? This way, I can, again, I can tailor my topic around what's motivating them. Because it's easy to alienate a group of students, because they, first of all, they don't understand, um, and that will alienate them. And also, they're going to be able to um, relate to what I'm talking about. That's because they just won't be able to relate. They might want to talk about Michael Jordan. They might want to talk about basketball, or they want to talk about baseball. If that's the case, then I can use my examples around those topics, so forth and so on. So the
Yeah.
motivational level.
Yeah, and that does, as you're saying, that sort of ties into what we were talking earlier about, just what their interests are. Those
Yeah.
are generally going to be the things that motivate them. But you may also, in learning that, you're gonna, your subject area may not be the thing that motivates them. So that's where you're going to have to kind of go that extra mile to try to figure out how to make those connections to something that will motivate them. And that also, again, gets back to kind of that learning style thing that, different students are going to be driven to do the work for different reasons and in different ways. So if you can get a bit of an idea about sort of how the students like to learn and then tie that into the things that motivate them, if you can bring those two things together, then that's going to really help you tailor the instruction. Um, yeah, so again, this is, I don't know that there's anything here that's earth shattering or necessarily like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that, but it's good to have it, I think, kind of laid out there so that you're thinking about these things with the ID plans that you're going to be doing. Um, you're probably going to run into one of two situations depending on what you've picked as your topic and what your current situation is. Because I know some of you are teachers, some of you are not teachers, and so on. But if you have an existing student audience that you would like to use as your model for this project, um, then absolutely you can do that. I don't want you like divulging privileged information like sharing their 504s or anything like that. But if it's helpful for you for the purposes of this class and this project to use a group of students that you have worked with or are working with and just kind of use them as, okay, if I was designing this for this group of students. If you're not in that situation, if you're not in a classroom right now, then in some ways you'll kind of get to make this up. So you can imagine a group of students and kind of just figure out ahead of time, like, well, what would this group of students look like, and then that'll give you a target you can aim for as you're doing your instructional design too. So either way, either if you're working off of an actual group of students or if you're kind of inventing a group of students, you still want to kind of understand each of these things. So if you're going to be inventing a group, you're going to want to kind of say, okay, well, demographically, this is, the age they are, and this is how they're split, gender wise or culturally, or what their social backgrounds are, or things like that. Just so you have that in mind, so you can, even though it's a pretend group of students, that you still have them in mind as you're designing the instructional design. So when you get to the work this week where you're doing that audience analysis, just kind of keep both of those in mind. If you've got a group of students, then I would say that's probably the best way to go, because you kind of see them, what they are already. But you can also sort of design more generically or for a group of students that you're kind of inventing, if that makes sense. So the last little thing here is, how do we get to know it? And really all that I want to kind of point out here is, I think when we talk about analysis and assessments and so on, there's kind of a mindset for some people that that's sort of like a formal thing. And that is certainly that is one way to get this information, at least some of the information. You could actually do a survey with your students. You could come up with a series of questions, hand that survey out, have them all complete it, and then you're sort of gathering that information in that sort of structured way. Or demographic information, you might be pulling that from PowerSchool or from whatever student management system you're using. Or you might be going to your guidance department or something like that to get a sense of what the cultural backgrounds are in the school or things like that. So that's certainly one way to go about it, is through some kind of a survey instrument or something along those lines. I'm just going to put PowerSchool here, but some sort of learning management system. But you can also learn an awful lot informally. It might take a little more time. It might take a little more effort on your part, but in some ways, the results might even be more accurate and better than doing a formal survey. Because as we all know, hand the students a survey, they've completed, I don't know, dozens, if not hundreds of surveys in their lives. And some of them are going to pay attention and answer the questions in a very thoughtful way. But others are just going to kind of fill in whatever first comes in their head and submit it and say, yeah, that's it, I'm done. So having those informal conversations, I this year very deliberately, our first week of school was only 2.5 days because we started on a half day and then only had a Thursday, Friday. I didn't go over anything about any of my classes in those first 2.5 days. I used those 2.5 days to just talk to the students, get a sense of who they are, what their interests are. We just had some sort of open conversations. What did you do over the summer? Did you go places? Did you play sports? And just started to kind of get that sense, that read on the students, of kind of where they're coming from. And you can have those conversations, and then if you want to jot down notes, if you're keeping a little chart of the students, you could jot down things that stick out to you about, this student plays this sport, or this student went here this summer, or this student is interested in, skiing or drawing or whatever. That is another way to go, which again can take longer and be more involved, but I think in the end probably gives you a more a deeper picture of the students, and sort of who they are and where they're coming from and what they're ready to learn and what they're looking forward to and what they're not looking forward to, and so on. So for these ID plans, I'm not expecting people to go out and actually develop survey instruments and so on. Use what you know about whatever target audience you're going to be doing. But down the road, if you're going to be involved in instructional design, this would be a first step for you to take. Before you get into the design, make sure you really understand who the students are, where they're coming from, and how you can, to go back to the very first thing that was said, how you can reach them where they are. And the only way you can do that is if you know where they are. Otherwise, you're going to be reaching in the wrong direction. So all of this is really important. I mentioned in the notes from last week, which I know we didn't have a chance to discuss, but with the context analysis, um, the idea that it's sort of a series of concentric circles of sort of layers of the community. The students are the center circle. So that's the beginning of this. And then from there, you can go like the level of the class is one community, and different classes are going to interact with each other differently. And then you can go to like the school level, and the school has a culture, and the school has a philosophy and an approach to learning that you need to understand. And then from the school, it might go out to the district level where the district has certain priorities, and then from there you move out into the larger community, that the school works within, and what are the priorities for that community and the backgrounds of that community and so on. So this really kind of is just another piece of that context analysis, but it's the bullseye of the context analysis. It's the seed at the middle of it. So I would have done this first, but because the needs assessment piece was kind of the bigger piece last week, I didn't want to have the two big pieces in the same week. So that's why I flipped them around a little bit. But generally, I would do a needs assessment, and in the process of that needs assessment, be also gathering information about the students generally. And then from there, looking at the larger context, and then from there, working outward to the goals and so on. All right. So, again, I just wanted to get you thinking about some things along these lines, why it's important to do these things, what kinds of things you want to get out of it. And it may not be the same for every situation, depending on what you're teaching. It may not be important to know, some of this information, but you can kind of tailor the information you need to get based on what the topic is that you're covering and so on. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, anything along those lines for about the audience analysis piece? All right. Give me 1 second here. I want to split up the video from tonight into a couple because I don't want it to get too long.